Stanford University.
Okay, hi. My name is Dave Ballmer. I'm an independent software developer. I have my own company called Gobico Games. Basically does mobile application development. Right now, focusing on WebOS with Palm because it's cool. There's nothing up here that's relevant to what I'm talking about yet, so bear with me. So I also have a day job because, independent software developers don't make tons of money. So there you go. My day job is with a company called Hippocrates. They do mobile applications development for medical reference software. So if I'm a little out of breath, it's from running over here. So you can tell I'm not like much of a jogger. So yeah, let's go with it. So how many people here have done regular web development for web pages and stuff? 1, 2, imaginary person over here. Okay, so we'll count that as 2. So if you've done a lot of work with things like jQuery, YUI, Dojo, and things like that, if you are going to go switch over into mobile development, you're going to find that those libs don't really work well. Like, you can still do stuff, but they're not going to be really fast. You take up a lot of memory. You're going to find yourself getting into a lot of garbage collection events, which on the desktop you'll never notice. On a mobile device, you notice approximately 10 to 15 seconds. Okay, so basically the idea is to sort of, if you've done, and I'm not going to focus on this too much, if you've done a lot of browser-based web development, you want to pull some bad habits sort of out of your tool chest. Either way. So if you find yourself doing a lot of lookups in the DOM, get element by ID, or if you're doing any of the cool shortcuts that are in jQuery stuff, if you do that, a lot, you're going to want to do some other things instead. So that's the sort of operation that takes a while. It's, again, not noticeable on a desktop, very noticeable on a mobile device, particularly if you're iterating in a loop. So one of the things I recommend is, if you're going to get references to things in the DOM, grab them, store them in a variable, keep them for later, and then take more of an application-centric approach instead of here's my DOM and I've got some JavaScript and I'm going to start moving stuff around, in the DOM. So what happens when you take an application first sort of mindset is, you're writing your code, you're writing your JavaScript in this case, and the fact that in the end, you're fiddling around with the DOM is sort of a lucky happenstance. Your application itself should have very little direct interaction with the DOM as you can manage to avoid. And right now that probably sounds a little odd, but I'll explain a little bit later as we go along. So the things I'm going to focus on is more on the presentation side of things. Canvas and CSS3 are like the two really cool things that are in HTML5 spec for presentation. Everyone here, I think, has already had kind of a quick intro to what these things are. Cool, I can skip some of this stuff then to make up for the lost time of being late. Okay, so I'm going to cover a couple examples, something in Canvas, something in CSS3. I'm going to talk about layering techniques, JavaScript efficiencies, and what I like to call trickery. All right, I'll get into what trickery is because I saw a couple eyebrows go up. So trickery, to me, I've always been a big fan of game development since I was a little kid. And of course, back then, game development was a little bit harder. I didn't actually have to flip the bits myself with a magnet, but it was close. So anyway, game developers historically sort of push the limits of any new device. When they go in there, they want to do as much as they can, and then twice as much, because that's what consumers want out of it. So when you do game development, you pick up a lot of tricks. And I'm going to cut ahead to that real quick, and then I'll step back. Shiny, 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 trickery. Okay, cool. The big thing with trickery is to pre-compute every single thing that you possibly can. This comes down to if you're going to draw something that runs around in a circle or runs in a figure 8, don't compute any of that stuff on the fly. If you have a loop, and in that loop you're doing some complex math, you're doing it wrong. You want to pull that out, put it into an array, or make the math much simpler. So if you have sort of say for example you're doing a circle and you want to store maybe 16 points around that circle that you can use later. So if you find yourself doing very simple math with that, simple scaling, simple interpolation between 2 points, that's okay. But doing the raw calculations of some sort of complex path, you want to sort of store that stuff in advance. So, and with HTML5 and WebKit specifically, both Canvas and CSS3 let you leverage native code without actually having to do native code. And what I mean by native code is basically stuff that runs a lot faster than you're going to be able to do with JavaScript, which we're going to go back to that in a second. And then this other thing, I mentioned garbage collection up front. JavaScript is an interpreter. Pretty much everything you do in it creates more objects. Objects go on what we call the heap. The heap fills up, and there's another process in the interpreter that comes by and says, wow, we're using a lot of memory. Maybe we shouldn't. And so it looks for things to remove, and that's what they call garbage collection, which on a desktop running in a browser, Safari, even IE, you're probably not going to notice these garbage collection events because modern computers run very fast, and even interpreters pretty much fly on them. But specifically running on a mobile device, you will notice this. So this is kind of like the pre-compute thing in a way. So if you're going to be using, say you're doing a game and you want to have a lot of sprites in it, say you're doing you're shooting something in animation. When it's done shooting, don't throw it away. Keep it. Keep a pool of those objects in an array and reuse it later. Very simple technique. It can make a huge difference between a really crappy game and at least a pretty cool game. So just to recap, a canvas is a box that you can draw magical pictures in, or not so magical pictures in. So my favorite editor is TextMate on the Mac. It's good stuff, can't beat it. Highly configurable, and if you have to use a GUI, it's the only one I recommend. Okay, let me make one quick change here. So while this is loading up, so Canvas lets you do, whoops, a couple of really things pretty well. So how many people here have worked with, say, Java 2D or, Apple's Cocoa 2D type stuff? Okay, 1, 2. Okay, cool. So Canvas has a lot of 2D primitives which are very similar. Basically, move to a point, draw from that point to some other point, draw an arc, draw a Bezier curve, other interesting things. It handles, you can set scaling for the canvas. So in other words, reset its internal coordinate system, which can be very handy. But it also lets you do image manipulation as well, which those other 2D libraries will do. So, basically grabbing parts of an image, doing transformations to individual pixels in the image, saving the image data off somewhere else, rotation of it, transformation, pretty much anything in there, either whether 2D primitives or images, you can do that kind of thing with. Cool, I have an emulator now. So what I've got is a very simple demo, and they'll get cooler as I go along. But I got to start somewhere. So what this demo does is I've set up a very simple class, which is a graph class. I'm using prototypal inheritance for this. So has everyone done like tons of JavaScript yet, or just a little? You don't know which way to raise your hand because it didn't indicate. Okay, so if you've done like a little, raise like one hand. If you've done a lot, raise two hands. I'm going to put two hands up. Okay, one hand each. Okay, cool. So I'll back up a little bit. Some of the confusing things about JavaScript traditionally is around its object model. And you find a lot of people that come from other programming languages like, say, Java or C++, have what you call classical inheritance model. And the thing that really trips people up about JavaScript is it's an object-oriented language through and through, but it doesn't have any classes. So how do you How do you make an object when you don't have a class? Well, there's actually, unfortunately, it turns out to be like about 50 different ways to do that, and about 48 of them are pretty terrible. Because what happens is other developers sort of want to sort of create their own ways of creating classes. So they create JavaScript code, which turns around and, sort of produces JavaScript code, and some of it can get really messy. So I happen to like JavaScript's object model. It uses what they call prototypal inheritance. There's a book that I highly recommend getting by Douglas Crockford, and there should be a link after this presentation. It's called JavaScript, The Good Parts. It's about a little under half an inch thick, and that tells you something right there. Really what it tells you is that JavaScript is a very simple scripting language that actually is very expressive. It's a very free sort of language. You can do a lot with it, which is good and bad. If you're a really good programmer, you're going to make fantastic code, and people are going to wonder at all the cool stuff you did with an interpreter. And if you're having trouble with the language, it will really show. So we'll leave it at that. So what I'm creating here is I'm creating sort of a class using a coding pattern. Basically, any object in JavaScript, including this function here, when I call this function, you can think of this as a constructor for this class. So when I go to create a new graph, it's going to call this function, and it's going to return basically a pointer or reference to this new object that gets created out of this. So this sort of serves as my constructor for this class. Objects have this other thing called prototype. And what prototype is basically it's a hash or a dictionary of named elements. So all of your members, whether they be methods or whether they be data, you can actually attach them to this prototype. And the neat thing is that if you were to create a subclass of graph here, say, I don't know, pie chart, all these methods that you've created are going to be in that subclass's prototype as well. And if you wanted to create your own version, say, of set data for the subclass, then you basically change set data under the prototype, and away it goes. So I'm not going to get into that too much. I highly recommend getting that book. Like I say, Good Parts. It covers all the good stuff in a nice, quiet afternoon's read. And you'll walk away probably doubling your JavaScript skills from that. Okay, so this is a very simple class. Basically, I feed it an array of integers. It does a little work to figure out the scale, because I want to have a vertical scale with it. So basically, it goes through the loop, computes a max. Easy stuff. It creates a X scale and a Y scale, clears our rectangle in our canvas, starts our path somewhere at roughly the bottom left, and then it loops through our data once again to draw all the lines. Pretty basic stuff. It doesn't get too much simpler than that. So, and this is one of the reasons I like TextMate as an editor. You can do anything with it. So I actually have a keybind set up for a makefile. I'm one of those weirdos that uses makefiles for my JavaScript projects. And part of that is that I use a code validator called JSure. There's other ones out there. JSLint is probably the most well-known. And what that does is it basically loads in all your JavaScript and looks for really obvious interpreter errors, which can be really handy at like 3 a.m. When you can't tell that you have like a dangling comma or a curly brace when you thought it was a square one, and all that kind of good stuff. So, wait. Okay, cool. And this is our fantastic app. See, we have a graph, and 4 people just fell asleep, but that's okay, because we're going to make this a little bit fancier. So if you remember, one of the other techniques that I was talking about that we ran through the slides really fast was one called layering. Now, what I've got is a CSS file in here. CSS is one of those things that most developers either hate it or really, really hate it. But what a CSS is anybody who's messed with it or hasn't messed with it too much it's a very simple declarative language for styling DOM elements. Okay, much simpler than that. So what I've got is I've had the same app, but I've invested a little bit of time in putting some styling into, well, basically what is an empty box with a line in it. And let's see what we get. Oh wow, it's completely different. So we've got an image, another image, and if we do fun things like we leave the app, you know, magically it animates in and animates out. All of that is done inside CSS. So the only thing that the JavaScript is doing to cause this, I've got an activate and deactivate method, and all I'm doing is changing the class name of basically my scene. And then the CSS takes care of all the animation and all that other type of cool stuff for me. So I'm going to keep going on that path. Oh, okay. This is a good one. So this is a funny little app. It's a screensaver, because everyone needs a screensaver for your phone. Not really, but it's fun anyway. And I'm going to show you real quick. So a few things in here if we walk through the code. You notice these two funny looking arrays here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a screensaver where things sort of fly out at you from the center of the screen. Now I could, in my loop, run a random x, random y, random x, random y. I could have some other algorithm in there. But what I've done is, I'm using a little bit of trickery here. I just have some predefined coordinates. And if you notice, they're not the same length. So one array is actually shorter than the other. So what's going to happen is they're going to sort of stagger, and it'll deal with this sort of pseudo-random looking arrangement. But again, I'm just stepping through an array in my loop, which is extremely cheap compared to running a random statement or doing something more sophisticated. Oh, sure. Let me change the text real quick. I think I have one. Is that better? Okay, cool. All right. So anyway, I've got an array of sprite images that I'm going to use. And I'm telling it, I've got basically setting a sprite pool. Again, I'm not going to create these sprites and throw them away, create them, throw them away. I'm going to be looping through a pool. So I've got a little loop here which creates my sprites. And all I'm doing is I'm creating DOM elements, setting a class name for them, setting a background image, which this is a little bit extra fancy stuff, setting a background image to match one of the file names I have in the array above. Pretty easy stuff. Adding it to our DOM structure. This is what the append child does. So anyway, what this next thing does is set up a mouse event, and I'll show you what that's for in a second. Now, there's another thing in here too. Something that people don't mention enough about JavaScript is that you can nest functions within functions within functions within functions within functions if you want, and it keeps track of scope resolution for each of those. So what I have down here is I have a lot of functions which are local to this one, and this is another coding pattern in JavaScript. This is called a module pattern. It's also in JavaScript, the good parts. Basically what it does is it creates an anonymous closure, and within it I can have the equivalent of class variables, private variables within, it gets really cool. But again, this isn't so much about putting in a library to pretend that we have classical inheritance. It's all about coding patterns, and that's one of the principal differences with really getting the meat of using JavaScript is understanding how it works, and then applying a few simple coding patterns to get what you want out of it. So we have all these helper functions, one for init, one for move, one for getPoint, and all these are local within that one function. And the advantage is that all these helper functions have access to the same variables that the main function has, and that's the nature of the closure. Okay, so we got through init. A couple helper functions there, down, up, set stages, center, next. Okay, next. Pretty much what next does is it sets it goes through the loop. So it takes the newest sprite in our array, and it sets the top and left for that thing to somewhere off the page. And then it sets the class name, the CSS class name, to move. And that's pretty much it. Then it goes down to, forget the path thing for a second, goes down to the oldest sprite and basically tells it to go back to the center and do its thing. And as you can see, we're not really doing much with the DOM to make this happen. And I'm going to run this real quick. Okay, we have flying stars. I don't know if you guys can see that too well because of our background choice. So we have flying stars in here, and we saw that the JavaScript that we're doing that loop, the important bits is about 6 lines. And what we're doing is we're telling CSS3 to do all the cool stuff for us. And I've added another little thing here. So you can see this is almost like a particle generator, because I can draw a path, really wobbly path. Here, let me do a better one. So what we've got is we have the origin for this sort of moving down in sort of a fireworksy sort of fashion. So just add a little bit of extra for a little bit extra fun. But again, CSS3 is doing all of the heavy lifting here. And the cool part about that is if we were to do this on the JavaScript side, it'd be a lot slower. So I'm going to show you the CSS3 for that real quick. And again, good citizen has got a deactivate in there. Everything goes away. And it looks like it's a cool effect, like it's, you know, like I'm having to work to make it go away. But really all I'm doing is I'm stopping the loop. And then all the things continue on their paths and sort of fly off the screen. Let's go over the CSS for that real quick. And if we have CSS. Okay. It's actually less in here than maybe you think. These are the 2 important bits for the CSS. I think you still read that. So we have 2 classes for these sprites. One is called start. And what start tells it is, well, these get superseded by the JavaScript, but by default, start will center your sprite on the screen, set its opacity to 1, which will make it completely visible, set its scale to 0, which will make it, well, non-existent in a pixel type thing, and it sets up all these WebKit transition stuff. And it's setting them all to 0 seconds, because what we want it to do is to take it from wherever it is. Yeah, and we want it to go to the state without taking any time. So we want it to instantly do it. And then we have the move class. We want it to scale up to 100%, so scale of 1. And then we want, I guess we're doing 1.1 second transitions for all of these different things. So left position, top position, opacity, and then WebKit transform plugs into our scale, wherever that went. Yeah, scale 0. So each time we do this loop, when we set it back to start, boom, little pixel in the middle screen. When we set the class to move and then set its top and left, that's all we're doing. CSS is picking up from there, taking the star, moving it to the top and left we had, makes it bigger, makes it fade out, you know, and away we go. So the net result of that is, if I go back to our JavaScript, we're only running this thing. So we're running this thing at 25 milliseconds in our loop. And we're getting about 5 times, well, I'd say at least 4 times that in frame rate with all those objects flying around the screen, you know, for having to do basically pretty little effort. So we can make this take even longer, so if we say 1/10 of a second. And so everything's going at the same speed, and the net result is we just have less stars. Because all we're doing in our loop is we're creating a new star each time that we go through. This is what I like to call sort of set it and forget it animation. Particle effects are a very common use of that. These are things that don't interact with the rest of the scene, with your game, or anything like that. But they can be achieved very easily using CSS3. Okay, cool. Any questions so far? Okay, one question.
Could you go over the queuing of the sprites, or how you are recycling them? Could you just like highlight
sure.
that in the code?
Yeah, that's not a problem. So the question is, can I go over the queuing of the sprites to show how that works? Okay, next. So here's a function in here called next. It checks to see if it's paused. If it does, then it doesn't do anything. This is in case we haven't cleared our timeout, and it comes in here, and we don't want it to do something when we told it not to. Basically, I have an index that's inside the closure called sprite index, and I just say if sprite index is greater than the length of our array, then we start over at 0. I mean, it's very simple. It's just looping through that. And then the other thing too, sprite path. Okay. So the bit where you drag it around the screen, that adds a little bit of complexity to what this demo used to be. So, so we've got a couple of helper functions: get next top and then get next left. Probably down here. Oh, yeah. Okay, cool. So get next top is doing the same thing. Remember, we had an array of top positions and an array of left positions. It's the same thing. I'm just looping through that array, grabbing the next one off the list, and then putting it in there. And again, it falls into trickery. One array has like 7 elements, one array has, I think, 9 or something like that, and they don't match up too well. So it's a pseudo-random looking effect when you get done with it for very little CPU power. Cool. Any other questions on this one? Okay. Easy enough. So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit and show off an actual game. I'm not going to show off all the code because we do not have enough time for that. That's one of the other things too. A lot of people, think JavaScript. They tend to think, small little scripts to do things, and it can do that. That's true. But if you want to do something really cool, just like any other language, you are going to have to actually code. Even though in the last example, we offloaded a lot of work onto the CSS side of it. You still actually have to code your app. It's not going to magically come together. So I'm going to show this one off real quick, if I can find it. This is an app called Poker Drops. It's for WebOS, so it works with Palm Pre and Pixie. It's actually written in a JavaScript framework that I created. It's a cross-platform framework, so this app has actually been tested on iPhone, iPad, Android devices 1.6 and above. Pretty much the same source code with basically a few tweaks at the library level. So that's one of the pluses. We're just now getting to the point where you could use at least WebKit-based JavaScript to do, apps across different platforms. My favorite is still WebOS because I don't actually have to do any work to get it working. It already, WebOS already speaks, sort of the language of the web. So it's definitely my favorite platform. So this is a pretty simple game, and I'm going to switch themes real quick. All the widgets in here are done using the framework that I put together as well. So all the UI and all that kind of stuff. The JavaScript for this basically says, create a button, create another button. And all of the cool stuff is handled inside the library, and then a lot of that stuff after that's offloaded into CSS. So all the transitions that you see and everything are CSS. If you watch, we get our little cards that sort of shuffle in. And the idea of the game is pretty simple. You want to go and find good poker hands, and then the better your hand, the better your score. You keep going, you have a time limit up at the top. When you're all done, there's your score, and away you go. And then, oh, that's a lot of jokers. Obvious things. You can't have more than 5 cards in a poker hand, all that kind of good stuff. But this is all, JavaScript sort of stuff using the techniques that we just talked about. Has achievements. For example, here I tried to use more than one joker in a hand. It won't let you do that. It's kind of a goofy achievement I threw in there. But there's a few others. Epic fail. I haven't done that one yet. The day is short. I can probably get it though. This kind of introduces, I guess, some sort of a more robust example of, what you can put together with all of this stuff. And this is using all the techniques that we talked about. So let's break it down real quick. So when I'm drawing, this leads into my next point. There's actually a canvas tag that's layered on top of all of this stuff, which I'm actually using to draw 2D primitives to draw the path that you're on. The alternative to that would be, if you weren't to use canvas, you'd have to draw, say, individual sprites for connecting all the different ways that you could connect things up. You'd have a bunch of image resources and use up more space. So why do it that way? In this case, I'm using the canvas. Saves me a lot of code, a lot of work. For example, if I want to change the style of what the line looks like, it's trivial. I can change it in the code. If those were, 24 to 30 graphics, I'd have to go recut all those graphics, which makes the development process tedious. I'm also using it to capture all of my mouse events. Another thing that typically happens with, just browser development is it'd be very typical to add event listeners for all the cards, and then an event listener maybe for the background, and drag and drop and all this kind of stuff, which is really complicated. Makes for very complex code, makes for inefficient code, because you have all these event handlers that it has to watch for. So what I'm doing is I actually have the canvas laying on top, and I have one event handler for basically when the user presses down, another event handler for when the user moves, and another when they lift up, for all of them. So I've only have those 3 event handlers for basically the entire game board. And since in the event handler you can get the XY coordinate of where they tapped or where they're moving over, I can easily use that to figure out where in the grid that they're touching. There's some other things too. If you were just to set up event handlers on each of these cards, remember that even though they have little rounded corners and spacer between, underneath, each one of these things is a box. All the DOM elements, when you come down to it, are boxes. So if you're trying to draw a diagonal line between one and the other, and these are all boxes, what would happen is it would actually trigger one of these or the other while you're trying to draw across. So this is another reason why, I want to completely use my own event handler for the whole board, and apparently I want to lose the game. 3-minute timer. So we'll do this again. So what I actually have it doing is it's a little bit smarter. When you press down initially, it's using sort of a straight grid, so it knows which one you're pressing down. But when you're going around them, instead of using the grid, I'm actually using more of an octagon sort of pattern to detect where I'm hitting or where I'm moving, so that it turns these corners in between cards into sort of a neutral zone, so you don't accidentally trigger things around. Stuff like that is the sort of thing you kind of need to do to have something that kind of works and something that it works well enough that they don't even notice it. And that's really what you want in your UI stuff as far as functionality is that they're just natural. They don't have to think about it. Okay, so other techniques in here. You can do the shuffle. If you watch closely, you'll see these things fly into their position, and then they're also sort of rotating and sort of going in a 3D kind of way as they fold in. That's also using CSS. CSS has 3D transformations. WebOS has minimal support for those as of 1.4.1. So I'm exploiting it to make these things look a little bit more like cards and a little less like rectangles that just sort of drop into place. So let me pull up another. You know what? I'm just going to pull up the file. Okay, now this one I'm running in the browser because Safari, current version of Safari, its WebKit actually has full support for some 3D stuff, which I'm going to show you real quick. So this is a fairly boring looking thing. It's high in a box. Actually looks really old Mac, like Mac Classic. But when I click on it, you can see what this really is a couple of objects that are stacked on top of each other in 3D. And I'll make it a little bit bigger so you guys can see that. So I'm not using OpenGL for this. I'm not using WebGL or anything fancy. I'm just using the CSS3 transformations that are now available to us. And again, it's the same technique as I was doing with the stars. I have one class for this state, and I have another class set up for, the rotated around, spinny, fly out state. So it makes the code for it trivial. I'm literally just changing the class name for the DOM element. The CSS for it is fairly trivial as well. Recent fish HTML. It's called fish HTML because originally it was going to be fish floating around in CSS, but it didn't look as dramatic as making things work in 3D. So here's the CSS for. I actually put all this together into one thing. I put this together last night. So I'm not going to get into too much detail on it. You can see here's our little telltale, dash WebKit dash. That means we're doing something fancy. There's a whole set of information in this. Apple, since they invented WebKit, they actually have some really good information on their developer site for CSS3 3D transformations. Ajaxine.com also has some good information on this. Mozilla, their developer pages cover a lot of stuff about this, and Canvas. So anyway, we're telling it we want to preserve 3D says if I have a child node that's in relation to a parent node in 3D space to sort of keep that. So when I do transformation, it kind of keeps it together. But this is the business end of it. I'm just telling it on this state, I want to put everything back to normal. So set our X and Y rotation back. Set up a transition speed. Card flip. Here we go. And card flip, all I'm doing is I'm telling it to rotate Y 180 degrees and X 60 degrees. That's it. And then you get this sort of 3D type of thing. Oh, I did get it. I got my epic fail trophy in the game. Score less than 0 points. Cool. All right. I pulled that up for a reason. Ooh, that's not going to work because of the web address. Okay, never mind. I was going to pull it up on my emulator, but I realized I don't have a connection. So what I'm going to do, WebOS currently doesn't support all the cool fanciness like that in the 3D transformations. It will do them, but without any sense of depth of perspective. So if you're, say, doing the card flip, instead of having it come out at you, it just sort of folds together into nothingness and sort of folds back, which has its uses. If you do things quickly, your users may not actually notice. Okay, so I pulled it up in Chrome. Chrome supports this stuff too. And just so WebOS doesn't feel too bad, Chrome has the same sort of not quite support for all these 3D transformations. If you notice, we don't have any depth between any of these things, no perspective in the transformation. But nonetheless, it is still capable of something kind of cool. And this brings us up to sort of cross-platform stuff. If in a lot of your games you're doing sort of these cool transitional animations between things, if you leave it up to the CSS layer, what's going to happen is you're going to get the best performance that that machine is currently capable of doing without having to do anything special in your code. So we have the same code here. Admittedly, this isn't as cool, but within certain limitations, it kind of does what I want it to do, and I don't have to actually change my code to get that done. All of the 2D sorts of transformations work pretty much across mobile platforms and your browsers. 3D ones are still a bit off. But if you think about the implications on this, we'll go back to this example where we're actually looking at this thing, in 3D. You can imagine having this be a little bit bigger. You can make a maze out of it. You can make a box out of it. You can tell the box to, on transition, to open up, a lid, close a lid. It doesn't have to be plain colors. You can texture it with PNGs, GIF files, whatever you want. And if you start to think about that, you kind of have the makings of first-person shooter, or at least a first-person walker, you know. Depends on the capabilities of your device, you know, maybe not, you know, yeah, anyway, so you're probably not going to be doing Halo with it, but, you know, maybe at least, I don't know, Quake. There, we'll go that way. You guys know what Quake is? Okay, all right, cool. Yeah, so you can imagine these, you know, little boxes and things having other things on it, and you kind of have the makings of something that you wouldn't necessarily expect from, you know, JavaScript. Certainly not out of a browser, certainly not without, you know, Flash or some of the other really cool plugins that do, you know, OpenGL and things like that. Browsers and mobile browsers are also adding hardware accelerated support for all of this stuff, which is really cool. iPhone currently has that right now with, I think the 3.0 OS has hardware accelerated CSS transformations. WebOS is hot on their heels. I heard by the fall, so you have hardware accelerated CSS transformations for WebOS as well. Android, not so much. But, you know, they're Google, so we have to still like them anyway. Anyway, cool. So I'm like pretty much done talking. If you guys have any questions or you know, want to walk through some of this code, anything, go ahead.
Could you, the two demo ones, could you possibly send us that code for like not obviously your app, but just the demo one?
Yeah, okay. So the question is, can I make at least the demo code available? And the answer to that is yes. Okay. So I'm going to be putting that up probably off my blog somewhere, hosted somewhere on GitHub or.
Is your JavaScript framework like available, or is that your first?
So very good question. So the second question is, the JavaScript framework that I have, is it available or is it mine? And I'm going to. So I actually have intention of making an open source version of it. That effort is sort of underway. I'm kind of talking with, if you guys are familiar with PhoneGap, I'm talking with some of the PhoneGap guys about maybe, so if you don't know what they do, PhoneGap does very low-level mobile browser compatibility between WebKit implementations. So handling things like launching emails, making calls on the phone, things like that. PhoneGap takes care of sort of that layer. But what we're kind of missing is, you know, really robust UI layer sort of on top of that. So yeah, so I am thinking about open sourcing that. Other things too, you know, one of the things that Palm introduced, but I haven't heard a lot of details about it yet, is a thing that they're calling WebOS Core. I don't know a lot of details. The implication is that somehow, you know, some of the core features of the WebOS UI may be available across platforms. So kind of stay tuned on that, because you know, WebOS has a pretty good framework themselves. So the reason I basically have my own is because I've been doing this a while, and I sort of walked in the door, you know, when Palm WebOS was new, with sort of my own, you know, my own framework kind of ready to go. And I'm old and I'm lazy, and it's much easier to use my own code than to learn someone else's code, even if it's something really easy. So that's kind of where I'm there with that. But yeah, all this will be available. My Twitter is @Balmer. And it's really, yeah. Quick slide. With animation. Anyway, yeah, so @Balmer. And the important thing to note is that there's only one L. No offense to current heads of large corporations named Microsoft. I'm not actually related to that guy. Some ways it might be good because I might have a lot more money, but I don't jump around on stage. And I don't know, YouTube it, you'll find lots of cool videos, but with BALLMER for that guy. And you'll see why I want to do some differentiation. Anyway, cool. Any other questions about this cool stuff? Have you guys started doing any apps yet with WebOS? Beginning? Yeah. Okay, cool. We can talk about that, I guess. All right, cool. Thanks, guys.
I actually had a question, because you said you've tested on that game on the different platforms, right?
Yeah.
Which did you feel was, I don't know, bringing you the most return? Because we had talked about what was the best business situation, whether you had lots of users and lots of apps, right? Or, you know, in certain situations where there was like kind of a critical mass to how many applications there were in the application store, you know. Which do you feel you had the most, I don't know if you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah, okay.
Do you feel you had the most like success with in the different application markets?
Okay, so the question is basically which application market do I prefer of the ones that I've had experience with so far. So Apple was the first, and if you go back to when the iPhone was new, well, not the first, but the first that anybody cared about. So if you go back to when the iPhone was new, they came out with it, and they said, oh, you want an SDK? No problem, the web is your SDK, you know, enjoy. That's what attracted me to the platform, because, you know, all the original apps were web apps. So my first experience with the Apple catalog was sort of before the catalog. I had an app that was sort of a strategy game. It was a, you know, editor's pick, and made absolutely no money off of it because it was, you know, hosted on my servers and then running through Safari. You know, sort of Apple opened up their catalog, you know, introduced the native SDK. And things sort of got a little different. Today, you know, if I were to completely start from scratch, trying to get in the Apple catalog is tough. Not just technically, because their SDK is not the easiest to get going. And yes, there are tons of apps out there, but if you really look, you know, at the vast majority of those apps, they're all running very simple engines, which, you know, like this, you know, 20, 30, 50, 100 apps that do almost the exact same thing underneath, with different wrapping on top. And the reason for that is it's easier to go grab a template, slap a couple things on it, and ship it, you know, with their SDK. And then that's another good, you know, question too. Your other question was, you know, things like concerned about, you know, will your app get recognized? You know, will you be able to build kind of a following in a giant pool? I think, you know, at this point it's really tough to get if you're coming in fresh on the App Store to, you know, grab a giant following. It's you know, you're behind. You're behind so many companies, you know, right now, just coming out of the gate, and just getting attention with that many apps out there is really tough. Android is turning into a similar sort of situation. Android's a different market too. Android tends to have a lot of appeal for, well, you know, geeky people. Geeky people like to get things free or as close to free as is humanly possible. And if you look at the Android catalog, if you're trying to do a paid app, if you look at it, right now it has the highest concentration of free apps. And a lot of this is because developers just kind of give up and say, yeah, we'll put it out there, we'll try to make money with ads or something like that. We're not going to fight the sort of hacker, you know, uber geek mentality of the app catalog there. I like WebOS right now because it's easier to get attention. You know, it's the newest of the bunch. It's very capable. There's a lot of cool apps in there right now, but there aren't so many that, you know, you can't do one that's even cooler and get noticed and actually have people, you know about who you are or who your company is that much faster. And if you are interested in cross-platform development, it's easier to take a following from, you know, one platform. You learn a lot of lessons from there, and then if you go to release on other platforms, you know, you have more resources. Hopefully, you know, if you're making some money off your app, if it's a paid app, you got a lot of feedback from users. WebOS community is also very tight, so the users tend to be really helpful. Like they want you to succeed. I don't see as many. You go to the Apple Store, you're loaded with like 1-star ratings. Like this app would be awesome, except it doesn't have this one feature, so I'm going to 1-star this. You know, because it sucks. I mean, that's all over. Even like the best apps, you know, have, you know, just tons of those. Just because it doesn't do this thing that I thought it was going to do, even though the developer never said it would, I'm going to give it a star type of mentality. Because there's so many apps, you know, the consumer mentality there is almost, we want the vast majority of these to fail so that I have less to sift through to find the good stuff. So if you're looking for an introduction to mobile development in general, that's tough. It's you know, fairly brutal. Whereas if you look at, you know, WebOS, I like a lot. Twitter application is a good example. How many Twitter apps can you have on a platform? Well, currently on WebOS, there's like 5 leading Twitter apps, and each one has, a pretty strong following of people that love this app, and some of them have defected from other apps to sort of move along. And the reason that is because it's an app that a lot of people need, and it's been easy. You take the initial offerings and you make a couple improvements on it, and now you have like something shiny and new that's on a well-worn path, which is an app that everybody needs. And so you end up with, Twitter app A, peaks and then kind of declines a little bit, then Twitter app B from another developer comes in and goes even higher, et cetera, et cetera. So it's kind of interesting that, you have an app catalog where you can make an entry into a busy feature set like that, which is Twitter, and still have a shot of, being recognized and getting a following. So short answer is, I like the smaller catalog if you're a new developer. If you've been around the game a lot, it makes good business sense to, focus on where the big market stuff is. Unless, and this is something that Palm they have an interesting strategy, and I think it's going to pay off for them long term. They're making it very easy to port from, say, Apple or even Android in some cases over to WebOS. So, you've got this web app, Bonanza in the catalog, and then you also have these, C++ apps that were actually originally written over for Apple. Need for Speed Underground and, a bunch of EA titles and Gameloft titles that you recognize. Most of those titles have been ported within, a week or two over to WebOS. So they're betting on the really big companies that make apps, going ahead and doing what makes sense to them, going for the big catalog first, but then spending a week or two backporting it to, another outlet where they can have like, you get the advantage of the smaller catalog, you get the loyal following, you get the people that are doing higher ratings on average. They seem to care more about your app. So it's kind of a best of type of thing. And as a JavaScript developer, you can go the opposite approach. You can start with something like WebOS, get a lot of attention from users, have them just pound your app and send you lots of good feedback. You end up with a really killer app, and when you're happy with it after it's been in the market for, a month or two, try to port it to some of the larger markets. So, really long answer to a very short question. Yeah, sure. Anything else? Any other questions? Okay, cool. I think we're done with questions. All right. Thanks very much, guys.
For more, please visit